The neighborhood looked like something out of a brochure, almost too perfect to feel real. Every house followed the same quiet aesthetic rules: neutral colors, trimmed edges, identical mailbox posts aligned with mathematical precision. The streets were clean to the point of feeling monitored, as if even a stray leaf would be noticed and recorded. From a distance, it appeared peaceful. The kind of place where nothing unexpected ever happened. But for those living inside it, the perfection carried weight. It wasn't natural order, it was enforced order. And enforcement always came with consequences. At the center of this controlled environment was the Homeowners Association, an organization that claimed to preserve harmony and property value. In practice, it acted like an invisible authority that shaped daily life in subtle but constant ways. Rules were not just guidelines, they were expectations backed by fines, notices, and inspections that appeared without warning. When the narrator of this story moved into the neighborhood, he believed he was entering stability. After years of unpredictability elsewhere, the idea of structured living felt reassuring. A place where everything had standards seemed like a place where nothing could go wrong. His house was modest compared to others, but well maintained. A small front yard sat under a young tree that had not yet grown into its full shape. The space felt like something he could gradually improve over time, a quiet personal project rather than a statement. At first, everything seemed normal. The first few weeks passed without incident. He observed neighbors going about their routines, watering lawns, adjusting decorations, attending to small maintenance tasks. Everything appeared orderly, almost calm. But then came the first notice. It was small, almost insignificant. A comment about minor landscaping inconsistency. A suggestion about alignment. Nothing dramatic on its own, but unusual enough to be noticed. He corrected it without complaint, assuming it was part of settling into the community. Then another notice arrived shortly after. This time it concerned something even smaller. A detail most people would not consider important. Again, he adjusted accordingly. He still believed this was routine enforcement, nothing personal. But patterns begin quietly. The notices did not stop. They increased in frequency. Each one focused on a different aspect of his property. Not large violations, but constant refinements, suggestions that slowly turned into requirements. It felt less like maintenance oversight and more like observation. What made it more unsettling was the contrast. He began noticing other properties with visible issues: uneven paint, cluttered yards, minor structural inconsistencies. Yet those homes remained untouched. No notices. No attention. No corrections demanded. Only his property seemed to be under continuous review. The feeling of neutrality in the neighborhood began to shift. It was no longer just a place with rules. It was a place where attention itself was selective. And selective attention always carried meaning. He started paying closer attention to how enforcement worked. Notices arrived with timing that often followed small improvements he made. It felt like progress triggered response rather than resolved issues. Each improvement he made was followed by a new correction. A pattern formed slowly in his mind. Not hostility, but repetition. Not punishment, but persistence. The system was not reacting randomly, it was tracking. Still, he did not confront it. He complied. He adjusted. He followed instructions. Because at that stage, resistance would have been emotional, and emotion without evidence rarely changes systems like this. So instead, he began observing. He watched how inspections were scheduled. He noted which homes were visited and which were ignored. He tracked timing between notices and neighborhood events. What he discovered was subtle but consistent. Enforcement was not evenly distributed. There was structure behind it, but not fairness. The HOA was not just a governing body. It was a network of influence, perception, and selective enforcement. And somewhere within that structure, decisions were being shaped in ways that were not entirely visible. The most influential figure in this system was never officially announced as such. There was no need. Authority in environments like this does not always wear a title. It often operates through presence, routine, and familiarity. She was always there in some form. At meetings. In inspections. In decisions that seemed finalized before they were formally discussed. People referred to her indirectly, carefully, avoiding unnecessary attention. Her influence did not need explanation. It was simply understood. As days passed, the narrator realized something uncomfortable. This was not random oversight. It was targeted attention. Not overt hostility, but structured focus. And once that realization formed, the neighborhood no longer felt like a peaceful place. It felt like a system watching him. By the time the pattern became difficult to ignore, the narrator had already begun to adjust his life in small, quiet ways. He checked his yard more often than necessary. He second-guessed changes that once felt simple. Even ordinary maintenance started to feel like a process that required invisible approval. What made the situation more complicated was that nothing was openly hostile. There were no confrontations, no direct threats, no visible aggression. Everything existed within paperwork, notices, and interpretations of rules that seemed flexible depending on who they were applied to. That ambiguity was what made the environment so difficult to challenge. When rules are written clearly but enforced unevenly, the system always appears lawful even when it is not entirely fair. As weeks turned into months, the narrator began to understand that the HOA was not just a simple administrative body. It functioned more like a layered structure with different levels of influence. On the surface, it appeared democratic, with meetings and votes. Beneath that surface, however, decision-making seemed concentrated in a much smaller circle. Most residents participated passively. They paid dues, followed notices, and avoided conflict. The HOA, in return, maintained appearances of order and consistency. But behind those appearances was a quieter reality, one where certain voices carried more weight than others. The narrator began reviewing public HOA documents, not out of rebellion but out of necessity. Meeting summaries, financial reports, and enforcement logs became part of his nightly routine. At first, everything looked standard. Budgets allocated for maintenance, schedules for inspections, and lists of general community guidelines. But inconsistencies began to emerge when viewed over time. Some expenses were reported without clear outcomes. Certain maintenance projects were listed repeatedly without visible completion. Enforcement activity, meanwhile, did not align with reported schedules. Some months showed heavy inspection activity concentrated on a few properties, while others showed almost none. The imbalance was subtle enough to be dismissed individually but clear when viewed collectively. The narrator also noticed something else. The tone of enforcement was not consistent across residents. Some homeowners received polite reminders, while others received strict notices for similar or even lesser issues. This inconsistency suggested not just procedural variation, but selective interpretation. Still, he remained careful. He understood that confronting the system without proof would only result in dismissal or escalation. So instead, he focused on documentation. He began creating his own records, photographs of his property, timestamps of notices, and comparisons with visible conditions of neighboring homes. This process slowly shifted his perspective. What initially felt like personal targeting began to look more like systemic behavior. He was not the only variable in the equation, he was part of a larger pattern. The neighborhood itself played a role in sustaining that system. Most residents avoided involvement not because they agreed, but because involvement carried risk. Challenging the HOA meant inviting attention, and attention in such environments often led to increased scrutiny. So silence became the default response. Even casual conversations among neighbors carried hesitation. People spoke in general terms, avoiding specifics. Complaints were shared quietly but rarely formalized. Everyone understood the structure, even if they did not openly acknowledge it. The narrator gradually realized that the HOA did not rely on force. It relied on participation shaped by caution. Compliance was not always enforced, it was often self-imposed. Within this environment, the figure of authority at the center of influence remained consistent. She was not the only member of leadership, but her presence shaped outcomes in noticeable ways. Decisions aligned with her perspective often progressed smoothly, while others seemed to stall or disappear into procedural delays. Her influence was not loud or dramatic. It operated through timing, approval flow, and subtle prioritization. Even when she was not explicitly involved, her presence was felt through outcomes. The narrator observed this carefully. He noticed which proposals advanced quickly and which were delayed. He tracked which homeowners received repeated attention and which were overlooked. Over time, a pattern of selective focus became visible. At the same time, his personal experience with enforcement continued. Notices still arrived, though now with slightly different tone. Instead of immediate corrections, there were longer explanations. Instead of isolated issues, there were cumulative concerns. It felt as though the system was adapting to his awareness. The emotional weight of this situation began to shift his mindset. At first, he had felt frustration. Then confusion. Now, something closer to analytical focus began to replace emotional reaction. He was no longer just responding to notices, he was studying them. He started mapping timelines. He noted how inspections often followed specific neighborhood events. He observed how certain properties received attention after visible improvements. He compared enforcement frequency across different homes and found clear imbalances. The more data he collected, the harder it became to dismiss the pattern as coincidence. Still, there was no direct confrontation. The system did not need confrontation to operate. It functioned through structure, expectation, and the assumption that residents would not question its internal logic. But beneath that assumption, cracks were forming. The narrator began to sense that the system depended heavily on perception. As long as it appeared fair, it remained stable. But if that perception shifted, even slightly, the balance could change. And that realization introduced a new layer to his thinking. This was no longer just about compliance or frustration. It was about structure. About how authority operates when it is distributed unevenly but presented uniformly. He began to understand that the HOA was not simply enforcing rules. It was maintaining control through consistency of appearance, not consistency of application. And in systems like that, awareness itself becomes a form of disruption. By the end of this phase, the narrator was no longer reacting as a resident trying to fix violation. He was observing as someone trying to understand how enforcement was being shaped. And that understanding marked the beginning of something irreversible that as time passed. The narrator's understanding of the neighborhood shifted from surface observation into something more psychologically complex. What once felt like a simple case of strict rules gradually evolved into a lived experience of constant anticipation. Every action outside his home carried an invisible weight, as if it might later be interpreted through a lens of scrutiny. Yet beneath the structure of rules and notices, something else began to emerge, something less procedural and more human. The emotional reality of living under continuous observation began to shape not only his behavior but also his perception of the people around him. At first, he had assumed that neighbors were simply indifferent. People kept to themselves, maintained polite distance, and avoided unnecessary interaction. But over time, it became clearer that this was not indifference. It was adaptation. Each resident had learned, in their own way, how to exist within a system that rewarded silence and discouraged involvement. The narrator began noticing subtle behavioral patterns. Conversations ended quickly when HOA topics surfaced. Outdoor interactions were brief, often limited to greetings and routine exchanges. Even shared frustrations were expressed cautiously, as if spoken too openly might carry consequences beyond immediate discomfort. This quiet restraint created an emotional distance between residents who physically lived close to each other. Houses stood side by side, but lived experiences remained isolated. The neighborhood functioned not as a connected community, but as a collection of parallel lives governed by the same unseen structure. Within this environment, the narrator's internal state began to shift. The initial frustration he had felt toward repeated notices slowly transformed into something more reflective. Instead of reacting immediately to each enforcement action, he began to process them with increasing emotional distance. Still, the pressure was real. Each notice carried implications, not just for property adjustments, but for how he was perceived within the system. Compliance was no longer just about avoiding fines, it had become a way of maintaining low visibility. The emotional strain of this constant self-monitoring began to accumulate. Even simple decisions, like adjusting plants in the yard or repainting a small section of trim, required consideration of how it might be interpreted. Over time, this created a subtle but persistent tension between personal intention and perceived expectation. Despite this, moments of connection did exist. Occasionally, brief interactions with neighbors hinted at shared understanding. A glance that lingered slightly longer than usual. A quiet pause that suggested mutual recognition of the same underlying pressure. These moments were never spoken about directly, but they existed nonetheless. The narrator began to realize that emotional bridges in such environments were not built through conversation, but through recognition. People did not openly discuss their experiences, but they often recognized the shared weight of similar experiences. This unspoken awareness created a fragile sense of solidarity. It did not form into organized resistance or collective action, but it softened the isolation. Even without words, there was an understanding that others were navigating the same invisible system. At the same time, his perception of authority within the HOA deepened. What once seemed like a distant administrative structure now felt more personal in its influence. Decisions were not abstract, they affected daily emotional states. A notice could alter the mood of an entire week. An inspection could shift the sense of security within one's own home. The figure at the center of influence remained consistent in this dynamic. Her presence within the HOA structure was not always direct, but it shaped the emotional atmosphere of enforcement. When decisions aligned with her perspective, they carried a sense of finality that discouraged further discussion. When they did not, they often slowed or disappeared into procedural ambiguity. This imbalance created an emotional undercurrent throughout the neighborhood. Residents learned, consciously or not, to adjust their behavior in anticipation of unseen approval patterns. The narrator, however, began to move in a different direction internally. Instead of adjusting behavior solely to avoid attention, he started observing how emotional responses were being shaped by the system itself. He noticed how quickly anxiety followed notices, how easily uncertainty spread after inspections, and how silence became a default coping mechanism. These observations led him to an uncomfortable realization: the system was not just enforcing rules, it was influencing emotional behavior. By creating conditions of uncertainty, it encouraged compliance without direct force. By maintaining selective attention, it shaped perception of fairness. By distributing enforcement unevenly, it ensured that no single pattern could be easily challenged. Understanding this did not immediately change his situation, but it changed his interpretation of it. He was no longer seeing isolated incidents. He was seeing a structure that interacted with emotion as much as with property. Despite this awareness, he remained careful not to act impulsively. Emotional reactions, he understood, were predictable. Systems built on structure often responded more strongly to reaction than to observation. So instead, he continued documenting, analyzing, and quietly building understanding. Meanwhile, subtle shifts began to appear in the neighborhood dynamic. A few residents started quietly comparing experiences. Without formal discussions, patterns of similarity emerged. Multiple households had received inspections after minor improvements. Several had experienced delays in approvals without clear explanation. The shared nature of these experiences began to reduce the sense of isolation. Even without open communication, a collective awareness was forming. The narrator found himself at the center of this gradual shift, not by intention but by consistency. His persistence in documenting and observing created a reference point for understanding patterns that others had only partially noticed. Still, emotional pressure did not disappear. Living under structured attention continued to shape his daily life. But now, it was accompanied by something else: clarity. He was beginning to see that the system relied not just on authority, but on emotional fragmentation. As long as residents felt isolated in their experiences, the structure remained stable. Once those experiences began to align, even quietly, the balance started to shift. This realization marked a turning point in his internal journey. He was no longer only reacting to the system. He was beginning to understand how it sustained itself emotionally. And that understanding created the foundation for what would come next. The atmosphere of the neighborhood began to change in ways that were subtle at first but increasingly difficult to ignore. What had once been a quiet pattern of isolated enforcement started to feel more coordinated, almost synchronized, as if different parts of the system were responding to the same unseen pressure. For the narrator, the shift was not sudden. It revealed itself through accumulation. A notice here. A delayed approval there. A brief inspection that followed closely after a minor, routine improvement. Individually, none of these events were extraordinary. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming harder to dismiss. He continued documenting everything, but now his records carried a different weight. They were no longer just personal observations. They were becoming a structured timeline of behavior, one that showed repetition, inconsistency, and selective attention across multiple households. Around this time, the neighborhood itself began to feel slightly more tense. Not openly, not in any dramatic way, but in small behavioral shifts. Residents spent less time outside. Conversations ended faster. Even casual interactions carried a sense of caution, as if everyone was subconsciously aware that attention could return at any moment. Then came a noticeable escalation. A wave of inspections began affecting multiple homes within a short span of days. It was not random. Several properties across different sections of the neighborhood received notices almost simultaneously. Some were minor, others more detailed and specific than usual. The narrator's property was included again, but this time the inspection felt more thorough. Measurements were taken with unusual precision. Landscaping elements were reviewed more carefully than before. Even previous compliance records seemed to be reassessed rather than accepted as settled. The change in tone was unmistakable. This was no longer routine oversight. It felt like a coordinated effort to reassert control over perception. What made it more significant, however, was what happened in response. For the first time, the narrator's documentation was not just passive record-keeping. It became structured input. He organized his findings into clear comparisons, before and after records, timelines of enforcement actions, and patterns of selective attention across similar properties. He did not present these findings as accusation. Instead, they were framed as questions of consistency. Why certain properties were inspected more frequently? Why similar conditions resulted in different responses? Why enforcement timing appeared to cluster around specific types of activity? This shift marked a turning point. The system was no longer only observing him. He was now formally engaging with the system's logic. The response from the HOA structure was slow, but noticeable. Instead of immediate corrections or dismissals, there were delays. Requests for clarification. Internal review notices. Procedural language that suggested the information had entered a higher level of consideration than before. For the first time, the structure appeared to be processing feedback rather than simply issuing enforcement. At the same time, something began to shift within the neighborhood dynamic itself. Word spreads quietly in environments like this, not through formal channels, but through observation and repetition. Residents began comparing their experiences more openly, though still cautiously. It became harder to ignore the similarity in patterns. Multiple homeowners had received inspections after completing small improvements. Several had experienced repeated notices for issues that others seemed to avoid entirely. The idea that enforcement was uniform no longer held up under shared comparison. Without any organized effort, a form of collective awareness began to form. It was not resistance yet. It was recognition. The narrator found himself at the center of this emerging awareness, not by intention, but by consistency. His documentation became a reference point for others who had begun noticing irregularities in their own experiences. Quietly, informally, people began to acknowledge that what they were experiencing might not be isolated. This shift changed the emotional tone of the neighborhood. Where there had once been quiet acceptance, there was now cautious evaluation. Where there had been silence, there was now observation. Within the HOA structure, however, the reaction was more controlled. Enforcement did not stop, but it became more deliberate. Notices were still issued, but the timing between them changed. Inspections became less frequent but more focused. It was as if the system was adjusting its own visibility in response to increased awareness. The central figure of influence remained present within this dynamic, though her presence felt different now. Less absolute, more reactive. Decisions that once seemed immediate now required longer processing. The certainty that once defined enforcement appeared slightly disrupted. Still, there was no direct confrontation. Everything remained within procedural boundaries. That was the strength of the system. It did not rely on visible force. It relied on structure that appeared consistent even when it was under internal strain. For the narrator, this phase brought a different kind of tension. He was no longer just documenting imbalance, he was now part of the environment that was beginning to reflect it back. His actions had not broken the system, but they had introduced friction into its stability. That friction became visible in small ways. Delays that were previously rare became more common. Requests that once moved quickly now required additional verification. Even routine communication carried a slightly more formal tone, as if the system was recalibrating its own response patterns. Despite this, the narrator remained cautious. He understood that visibility could escalate attention. His approach stayed consistent: observe, document, compare, and avoid emotional reaction. But internally, something had changed. The feeling of isolation had weakened. The belief that he was experiencing something entirely individual had been replaced by the understanding that others were encountering similar patterns. And that realization altered the balance. The HOA was no longer operating in an environment of unquestioned acceptance. It was now functioning under emerging awareness. Even if that awareness was quiet, even if it was unorganized, it still mattered. Because systems built on perception are always sensitive to recognition. By the end of this phase, the neighborhood no longer felt like a static environment. It felt like a structure under observation from within. And that subtle shift marked the beginning of instability that could not be easily reversed. The shift did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, buried inside routine processes that initially looked no different from anything that had happened before. Yet beneath that normal surface, something fundamental inside the HOA structure had begun to unravel. The narrator first noticed it in the tone of administrative communication. Where earlier responses had been firm and absolute, they now carried hesitation. Statements that once ended discussions now opened them. Requests that had previously been dismissed outright were suddenly marked for further review or internal clarification. At first, these changes seemed minor. But for someone who had been tracking patterns for months, even slight deviations carried meaning. Then came the inconsistencies. Documents that should have aligned no longer matched across different records. A maintenance expense listed in one report appeared altered or missing in another. Inspection logs showed gaps that did not exist before. Timelines that had once been linear now contained overlaps and contradictions. It was not just error. It was instability inside the system itself. The narrator began organizing these discrepancies more aggressively, cross-referencing every available record. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that the HOA structure was not as unified as it appeared. Beneath the formal presentation of order, there were fractures, differences in how decisions were recorded, processed, and justified. What emerged was a pattern of centralization disguised as collective governance. Certain decisions, especially those related to enforcement priorities, consistently aligned with a narrow internal influence chain. While official documentation suggested group approval, timing and outcome patterns indicated that actual direction came from a more concentrated source. This realization reframed everything he had experienced. The selective enforcement. The repeated attention. The uneven application of rules. None of it was random. It was structured through influence that was never formally acknowledged but consistently reflected in outcomes. And now, that structure was showing strain. A key moment came during a routine HOA cycle when multiple homeowners, not just the narrator, began receiving conflicting notices for similar conditions. Some were instructed to correct minor issues immediately, while others were told the same conditions were acceptable. The inconsistency was no longer isolated, it was visible across the neighborhood. This inconsistency triggered something deeper within the system. Internal disagreements became apparent through procedural delays. Decisions that were once finalized quickly now stalled. Some enforcement actions were reversed without explanation. Others were quietly withdrawn. The system was no longer projecting certainty. The narrator's documentation, once a private record, had now become indirectly influential. It was not that his work was publicly acknowledged, but it had introduced pressure into a system that relied heavily on uncontested authority. When patterns become visible, they stop functioning as invisible control mechanisms. And once visibility increases, control begins to shift. The most significant development, however, came from within the HOA structure itself. Through indirect channels, public records updates, revised meeting summaries, and altered enforcement patterns, it became clear that internal review processes had intensified. Financial records were being audited more thoroughly. Enforcement logs were being re-examined. Decision chains were being questioned in ways that had not occurred before. The structure was investigating itself. Within this process, something unexpected surfaced. A series of decisions related to enforcement prioritization did not align with documented approval procedures. Certain actions had been consistently routed through a narrow decision pathway that bypassed broader committee input. This was not outright illegal in formal terms, but it was structurally significant. It meant that while the HOA appeared collective, certain influences had disproportionate control over outcomes. And as scrutiny increased, that imbalance became harder to maintain. The narrator began noticing behavioral changes in how enforcement was being handled. Previously targeted attention toward his property reduced noticeably. Not because issues disappeared, but because the system's focus had shifted inward. Other residents experienced similar changes. Some enforcement actions were paused indefinitely. Others were re-evaluated entirely. The consistency that once defined the HOA's behavior had broken into uncertainty. The neighborhood atmosphere reflected this shift. Where there had once been cautious compliance, there was now cautious observation. Residents were no longer just reacting to notices, they were comparing them, discussing patterns indirectly, and recognizing inconsistencies more openly. Even without formal organization, awareness had spread. And awareness, once distributed, is difficult to contain. Inside the HOA leadership structure, tensions began to surface more visibly. Procedural disagreements became more frequent. Delays increased not because of external resistance, but because internal consensus was weakening. The centralized influence that had once shaped enforcement so smoothly was now encountering resistance from within its own structure. And this is where the unexpected revelation fully emerged. The system had not been designed as a rigid hierarchy from the beginning. It had evolved into one through gradual concentration of decision-making authority. Over time, Procedural influence had shifted from distributed governance to centralized control, not through formal redesign, but through accumulation of procedural precedents. In simpler terms, the system had become imbalanced not by design, but by gradual drift. That drift had gone largely unnoticed because the appearance of structure remained intact. Rules still existed. Meetings still occurred. Records still formed. But beneath that appearance, actual influence had narrowed. And now, that narrowing was becoming visible. The narrator understood the significance immediately. Systems like this do not collapse suddenly. They destabilize when their internal inconsistencies become too visible to ignore. Once that happens, authority no longer feels absolute, it becomes negotiable. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, the narrator was no longer simply observing the system. He was observing its correction. And the correction was not being driven by any single individual action. It was the result of accumulated visibility, distributed awareness, and internal contradiction finally reaching a threshold where it could no longer remain hidden. Still, nothing was resolved yet. The structure had not fallen. It had only begun to shift. And in systems built on perception, even partial shifts can reshape everything that follows. The narrator's role in this transformation remained indirect, but undeniable. His documentation had not destroyed the system, it had revealed how it functioned under pressure. And once that was visible, the system itself began to change in response. What came next would determine whether that change stabilized into reform, or fractured further into collapse. The final phase of the situation did not arrive as a single defining moment. It unfolded gradually, like a structure losing balance not through collapse, but through continuous correction that slowly changed its shape. The neighborhood that once felt rigid and controlled began to shift into something less absolute, more uncertain, and ultimately more transparent. For the narrator, the change was immediately noticeable in the absence of pressure rather than its presence. The constant cycle of notices that had once defined daily life slowed significantly. Inspections still occurred, but their frequency diminished, and their intensity lost the sharp focus that had once made them feel personal. What replaced it was something unfamiliar in that environment: procedural neutrality. The HOA system, once perceived as selectively focused and inconsistently enforced, now appeared to be undergoing restructuring. New layers of review were introduced. Enforcement guidelines were rewritten in more standardized language. Decisions that once seemed influenced by informal authority were now routed through clearer, documented processes. It was not a dramatic transformation. There were no announcements of downfall, no public acknowledgement of internal imbalance. Instead, the system quietly adjusted itself in response to accumulated pressure and visibility. The narrator observed these changes carefully, not as a participant, but as someone who had become deeply familiar with the system's behavior patterns. He could recognize when a structure was stabilizing versus when it was compensating. And what he saw now was stabilization. The most significant change was not procedural, however. It was behavioral. Residents of the neighborhood began to act differently. The atmosphere of caution that had once dominated interactions slowly softened. People spent more time outside. Conversations lingered slightly longer. There was still awareness of rules, but less fear of unpredictable interpretation. The emotional environment of the neighborhood had shifted from tension to cautious normalcy. Within the HOA itself, leadership dynamics also changed. Decision-making, once concentrated in narrow channels of influence, became more distributed. Committees that had previously functioned as formalities began to regain actual procedural weight. Records reflected more consistent application of guidelines across different properties. The imbalance that had once shaped enforcement behavior was no longer visible in the same way. For the narrator, this created a complex emotional response. There was relief, but also reflection. The situation had not ended through confrontation or victory. It had ended through exposure of inconsistency and gradual structural correction. No single action could be credited as the cause. Instead, it was the accumulation of observation, documentation, and comparative awareness that had contributed to change. What stood out most to him was how fragile the system had actually been beneath its appearance of control. It had not required force to correct. It required visibility. As the neighborhood stabilized, the narrator's own experience changed significantly. The property that had once been the center of repeated attention now existed within normal enforcement patterns. Minor issues, when they appeared, were addressed in the same manner as others. There was no longer selective intensity, no lingering focus, no pattern of repeated scrutiny. For the first time since arriving, the environment felt evenly applied. Yet the deeper realization that followed was more important than the external change. The narrator understood that the system had not been inherently malicious in structure. It had been vulnerable to imbalance. Over time, authority had concentrated, not through design, but through accumulation of procedural advantage and unchecked influence. Once that concentration became embedded, it shaped behavior across the entire neighborhood. But it also demonstrated something else. That even structured systems, when operating without transparency, are susceptible to correction once patterns become visible enough to be questioned. The moral weight of this realization was not about confrontation or rebellion. It was about awareness. The narrator reflected on how easily perception can shape authority. In the beginning, the HOA had appeared absolute, even intimidating in its consistency. But as inconsistencies were documented and compared, that perception weakened. Authority, once questioned through evidence rather than emotion, lost its ability to operate invisibly. The lesson was not that systems are inherently flawed, but that systems require balance between structure and visibility. Without that balance, even well-intended frameworks can drift into uneven application. Another realization followed more quietly. Most of the change had not come from direct opposition. It had come from persistence in observation. The act of recording patterns, comparing outcomes, and maintaining consistency in documentation had created pressure that the system eventually had to respond to. It was not confrontation that shifted the structure. It was clarity. As months passed, the neighborhood settled into a more stable rhythm. HOA meetings became more procedural and less influenced by informal authority. Enforcement became more predictable. Residents gradually adapted to a system that now felt less arbitrary. The narrator no longer felt like he was operating under observation. Instead, he felt like he was part of a shared structure that functioned more evenly. But even as stability returned, he did not forget the process that led there. He understood that systems are rarely fixed in a single state. They are constantly shaped by behavior, perception, and participation. When those elements become unbalanced, correction eventually follows, but only if the imbalance is recognized. In that sense, his experience was not about defeating a system. It was about revealing how it functioned when examined closely enough. And that revelation carried its own lasting impact. The final moral reflection that remained with him was simple, but significant. Control does not always appear as force. Sometimes it appears as structure that feels normal until it is questioned. And when that structure is examined carefully, its weaknesses are not always dramatic. They are procedural, incremental, and human. The neighborhood did not become perfect after the change. It became more honest in how it operated. And for the narrator, that difference mattered more than perfection. In the end, the story was not about one individual turning a system against itself. It was about how visibility changes systems that depend on inconsistency. Once patterns are seen, they cannot be unseen. And once they are shared, even quietly, they begin to reshape the environment around them. What began as selective pressure ended as structural correction. And what remained was not victory or defeat, but understanding. The HOA still existed. The neighborhood still functioned. Life continued in its ordinary form. But beneath that ordinary surface, something fundamental had changed. The system was no longer invisible. And that changed everything.